Okay.
All right, and we are live. G'day, it's Scotty North, and this is Zenium Live. And welcome. It's 3:30 on a Thursday afternoon. So grab a cuppa and a bicky and join us for a bit of a chat. And today, well, I'm in the Wild West, and I'm joined with PJ, who's at where the heck are you, mate?
Well, I'm broadcasting from the stairs of the Federal Reserve behind me, a very famous and infamous institution in global monetary policy. They're all in there right now, contemplating how they're going to next, I suppose the next thing they're going to do to destroy the purchasing power of everyone, which I know is one of the topics we're going to talk about today, which is money creation. So they're in there right now printing money like crazy to juice up the world economy. So I thought we'd broadcast live from the steps of the Fed Reserve today.
All right. Well, look, that's handy because I reckon the first question we've got is in our little promo we did. How is money created and who pays for it? Let's kick off with that. I mean, how
Yeah,
is
yeah.
money created?
Well, money is one of those very interesting topics that I think people have a general misunderstanding of. And they think that, and in the old days, of course, the way money was effectively created was it was printed on a piece of paper. And it was backed by something. And I know we've talked about this in previous shows, the gold standard and those sorts of things. But money nowadays is for the most part, is digitally created. So banks no longer, and the central bank no longer prints a bunch of currency, although they do, of course, print currency. But we have a very, very small amount of currency to actually cover all of the actual deposits and things that were in the banks. But this is going to blow the minds of our global audience who may not understand that money is actually loaned into existence. I'll say that again. It is loaned into existence. So in a previous show, we
Okay.
talked about, yeah,
Just, I think that's a really good point. I mean, so it's loaned as in, so it's actually a debt.
that is correct. That is absolutely correct. So at the moment, and we've talked about this before, no currency on the planet is backed by anything. It is digital and paper money printed by the reserve banks of the various countries, backed by nothing but the full faith and credit of that institution, which is the reserve bank of that country. And that's why it is called fiat currency, because it is a declared currency. The realm says that the currency of this realm will be, because, well, I'm in the US at the moment, of course, will be the US dollar, and you're in Australia. And the realm says that the currency there will be the Australian dollar. So it's all by fiat. There is nothing backing up these currencies whatsoever. So when it is actually loaned into existence, what that means is that the central bank credits, they can do it in several ways. They can credit banks, so they can just simply hit a button on the computer and say, Westpac, you now have $1 billion in your account that you can go and do whatever you like with. But the typical mechanism is that, in the US anyway, the Federal Reserve will buy government bonds. So the government will issue securities, they're called bonds and bills, treasuries, broadly speaking, and the Federal Reserve will buy those. And so effectively what they're doing is they're creating money out of thin air. They're buying the government bond, and effectively then they're giving the government that money. So that is how money is created and loaned into existence. So it is because of a debt. And you might have heard me say this before, but our global monetary system is currently a debt-based monetary system. And hopefully what I just explained tells you exactly why, or shows you exactly why it is debt-based, because all money is created because it is lent into existence.
So on the government front, I mean, to me, I'm not particularly sure why there would have to be a debt created to do that. I mean, you could just print the money, give it to the government without creating the bond, right? And just put it into existence.
Of course you could. And there's a lot of debate about this at the moment, where they're saying, the Federal Reserve is, and other central banks around the world are doing the same thing. They're printing a lot of money, and they have to get it effectively. They've got to get it into the banking system. So, I mean, this is a whole nother, thing that we could talk for hours and hours about. But the stability of the banking system, I should say, is the transmission mechanism for wealth and payments and everything else in our system. So back when we had the GFC, Ben Bernanke was the head of the Federal Reserve in the U.S., and he was printing money like crazy. And they got to a point, I remember in the media hearing this, they were talking about Ben Bernanke, I think he even made this statement at a congressional testimony, because he has to testify every month, I think, before Congress, tell them how great the economy is doing. And he said, we might just have to rent helicopters and go drop money out of helicopters. And it was kind of a euphemism for saying that we would just print money and we'll just throw it out there so people
and
can
helicopter
we'll
money
get it
was
and go
born.
spend it. And helicopter money was born, and that terminology was born. Yeah, that was fun times.
So, I mean, obviously, because you're so obviously in the US broadcasting live to our global audience from there,
Yeah.
That's fine for the US, right? But I had this a chat with someone, only a month ago, and this topic came up, and they said, "Oh, that's the US. What about Australia?" So, it's the same thing.
Exactly the same mechanism. We have a central bank, and it is exactly the same mechanism as to how money effectively gets created and put into the system. Now, the banking system is also allowed to do this function. And so the way banks do this is, again, they loan it into existence. So if I go to a bank and I say, I would like to borrow money to buy a house, and I meet all the criteria, et cetera, they say, sure, you can have $500,000. The day of settlement, the bank, once I sign my mortgage docs, they now have an income stream coming from me, so I have to make the interest and principal repayments, or maybe just interest. But they now can create the liability, or they can create the credit. So they wouldn't credit me directly, but they would send, $500,000 to the vendor, for example. And that would show up in the vendor's bank, or his mortgagee would get paid off, and he or she might have some extra money. But that's how the banks effectively do the same process. They create money out of thin air. And this is a process, and of course we did talk about this, I think, the last time we spoke. We have a system called a fractional reserve system. And so what that means is that...
Before you jump on that, because I want to go to that next point, for those of you playing at home, let's have a look at this screen here to sort of cement what PJ is saying. If you go to Google and you type in money creation RBA, okay, and which I've done. Here's one I prepared earlier, PJ, and we go down to the second the second result is an RBA speech done at the end of 18. Okay, so we click on that, and this is by Christopher Kent. There's his lovely picture there, and I'll scroll down because I've read this a few times, and there's a couple of things let's touch on before we get to this fractional reserve thing. Here's a graph by the RBA on, I guess, what you call it, the current amount of money and how it's made up in the system. So what's banknotes, what's not, all that sort of stuff. So let's just quickly go through this. So all we need to say is that on this graph here, and it's a lot of sort of, we're talking over $2 trillion, right? So $2,000 billion in funds. This is in June 2018. So I wouldn't want to hesitate to guess what it would be now. The long and the short of it is, the purple part is physical money or physical currency. Let's not get into money. Physical currency.
Yes.
Right? And that's the part there. So we're talking, I don't even know what that is, mate. What do you reckon that is? Probably like 70 billion or something?
Yeah, I don't know.
Maybe tops 100.
I know it's not a lot. I think we have enough physical currency to cover about maybe 0.5% or something of all money that is out there. I'll actually Google that right now and just see if I can find
so you
that,
do that.
it's very interesting.
So this purple, for those of you playing at home, the purple one, and of course you can't see this if you're on our Real Property, Real Wealth podcast, but you look up that Google search money creation RBA, and you'll get to this speech. And you'll scroll down, you'll see the purple part is physical currency. The rest is non-physical currency. So it's money in the system, but it's literally on the dots and dashes of a balance sheet and digital currency, digital environment. So that's the graph. Now, we go down here to the section of the speech, and it says, how is money created? And goes on, blah, blah, a bit of what PJ says, and you can withdraw currency from an ATM, etc., etc. And he goes on and says that the vast bulk of broad money supply consists of bank deposits, which is what PJ is about to get into. And this section here is a really good one, right? So money can be created when financial intermediaries make a loan. Now, that's what, PJ, you're talking about. When the banks make a loan, money can be created, okay? Yes. And then it goes on to say the bank may directly credit the deposit account of the seller on behalf of the borrower, right? In either case, the loaned funds will tend to find their way into a deposit somewhere in the banking system. This process adds to the supply of money. Now, I know we're going to get to inflation shortly, but that's the piece of information we want to really focus on. Money's created, financial intermediaries make the loans, and this process adds to the supply of money. Mate, it's there in black and white. Australia, speech from the RBA, you can't get any more than clear than that.
No, not at all. And, I suppose this piece of information probably surprises a lot of people because, again, I think I sort of mentioned a moment ago that a lot of people think that when money is put into the bank or currency is put into the bank, that the bank retains 100% of that. But the reality, as you can see, is far different than that. They actually are able to, and this is what I was saying about the fractional reserve system, is they're able to retain a very small portion of that. It's called the reserves. And the rest of it, they can lend out. And then they can scale that and grow that because of their ability to write mortgages and just effectively create money out of thin air. Now, there's obviously some things that they have to meet, some capital requirements and prudential requirements. But the long and short of it is that, and I know this is probably about a month and a half, 2 months ago, somebody was talking about, we had a comment from somebody saying, don't start a bank run. But the reality is that if every single Australian, and I looked it up, there's only 80 billion worth of physical currency. And we've got 2 trillion plus
there you go.
of banking
I guess 70,
system
mate.
assets. So if everybody turned up and said, I want my money out of the bank and to have it in physical cash, they cannot meet the demand for that.
Mate, that's not even close. What is that? That's 2,000 billion over...
It's like 0.008 or something,
0.04% or something? 0.04% of
very
real money,
it's
of
well
money
less than
is real
1%.
tangible stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, it's scary when you look at the banking system that we know today. And again, I've said it before, I'll say it again. The banking system is all about confidence. And every time we have a really serious economic calamity or situation like the one we're in right now with this COVID-19 thing, the banking system can find itself under pressure. And the only thing keeping it together is that people all don't show up at once at the same time and demand their money out of the bank. We've seen this happen before. It happened during the GFC in, I think, a bank in Northern Ireland called the Rock, maybe, something like that.
Yeah. Yep.
There was a couple where there were bank runs, and it then started. And as soon as a bank run actually starts, it infects everything. And this is the problem that we had in the GFC. And this is what policymakers, the central bankers, even the bankers are so fearful of.
Yeah, that's a good point. Now, I've got a couple of people dropping past. Michael is asking, is that a cowboy hat? Yes, Michael, it is a cowboy hat because we're in the Wild West, right? It's money for everyone. We're just printing it off and away we go. It's like the gold rush, except with fake gold, right? It's just with paper money. So yes, mate, it is a cowboy hat, and thanks for dropping by. So PJ, we've touched on how money's created and whether people understand that or whether they need to go and look a bit further, then be our guest, and perhaps we need to put out a in-depth video on that, like we can actually whiteboard some stuff, because it is a lot for people to take in to account. I remember that when I was a kid, I used to sit there watching the, before the weather, they had the finance report on the news. My parents always watched the 6 o'clock news, and they'd have them. I didn't have any idea that the dollar value and this and that. And I'd say, well, if they need more money, can't they just print it? And they'd be like, oh no, you can't. They don't do. That's not how it works. Yes, Mum and Dad, that is how it works. And when I was 8, I was right. I just didn't know it. But that's not the point. Hello to Mum and Dad if you're watching, and I'm sure I'll get those lovely texts and emails later. But the point is that, okay, this money is created. It's created through debt. Now, it's essentially a debt. Let's just, before we move on to inflation, I want to get a question right. You've touched on that there's $2 trillion in the money system, and there's 80 billion in real cash or whatever it is, right? That aside, if this money is created with interest attached to it, doesn't matter whether it's 0.5%, 2%, 3%, it doesn't matter, then my head straight away goes and says, well, it can never be paid back. The only way that you can pay back this money is by more money creation, because you can't give someone $10 in a game of Monopoly if $10 is the only thing there and say, you've got to pay me back 11.
Yes, it is a challenge of the current system that we have, because in the past we had a gold-backed system, and we went through this before, and I think in our last episode, talking about gold and the fact that the currency was being printed, and what was happening is nations like France and Germany were bringing the U.S. dollars that were gold-backed to the U.S. and saying, we want the gold, and the U.S. gold reserve dropped. So in the past, when the currency was exchangeable for something real, if you printed too much of it, you then had no longer had the ability to pay out that thing that was backing it because you ran out of it. And so you're absolutely right, is the system is only perpetuated due to the growth of debt. Now, in the system, they call it credit. Sounds a better word. Sounds like a better word than debt, right? But that is exactly right. The system will only function for as long as they are able to continue creating debt and getting it out into the world to facilitate trade and to have businesses create value by taking raw materials and changing them into other things. And of course, you and I expending our labor to offer consulting or other things that we do to clients, and we create value and get paid to do that. And that's how, I guess, money flows around the system and how value gets created, and as such GDP grows. But it's a real conundrum, because at some point throughout history, a debt-based or a fractional system always collapses. It will always collapse under its own weight. And, I don't want to scare anybody, because the reality is if the system collapsed tonight, well, you're going to wake up tomorrow morning, you're still going to have a roof over your head. Hopefully the power will still be on. Everything will kind of be, you'll still have your hat available to wear. Yep. Now, you might need a couple of 6-shooters on your side to defend your property, but at least you got part of the costume going.
That's right.
But the world would continue to exist. We would just have to redraw the monetary system. And back in Roman times, actually, this is quite interesting. Back in Roman times, every 50 years or so, they would have this thing called a debt jubilee, because the concept of debt has been around since we've had a monetary system, since we've sort of had a quote unquote civilization. But they realized that people would get so deep into debt that they would never be able to get out from under it, and they would have this thing, a concept called a debt jubilee. And they basically said, all debts are forgiven. That's it. You start over, wipe the slate clean. And I suppose that would have ushered in a whole new period of economic expansion, growth, and prosperity for potentially hundreds of years. But again, they did it every sort of 50 years during the Roman period. But very interesting concept regarding a debt jubilee. But yes, so to lock it all off, and I suppose to wrap that concept up, the system itself, you cannot build a skyscraper to the moon because it will eventually topple under its own weight. And as such, again, you cannot have a monetary system that just forever expands. At some point, you have to have that system be rejigged.
Yeah. Yep. No, that's right. And look, the skyscraper to the moon is a problem because the Earth's flat and the moon's like inside the thing anyway, isn't it? Isn't that how it works? I don't know. Yeah,
It would.
Who knows?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, the next thing that we're going on to is inflation. That was the second big topic we want to talk about because the two are very, very connected, right? So I learned many years ago, and you tell me if this is right, is that inflation isn't prices going up, it's actually the amount of money in the system. So because people always used to look at inflation and say, oh, well, prices are up, that's inflation. But that's kind of like the result of inflation, right? It's not actually inflation.
That is 100% correct. The classic definition of inflation is actually the growth of the money supply. So as you can see, I don't know if you still have it handy, but you can put that chart back up and you can see that we have had a tremendous amount of inflation of the money supply. It's grown from whatever it was, 1 trillion in 2009 or 2008 to 2 trillion in 18. And it's, as you say, it's probably 2.5 trillion now. And so there's another concept that I'm just going to introduce real quick called the velocity of money. And that's actually what causes inflation. So let me just explain that. So the simple fact that we have $2.5 trillion of deposits and currency and all this other stuff out there doesn't necessarily mean that we will see prices rising. So until, all of our hundreds and thousands of viewers watched this video, they probably didn't, as you say, they didn't equate prices rising, they equated prices rising to inflation, but they didn't realize that that was the after effect. So the after effect is prices rising. Inflation of the money supply is what is the eventual cause of asset price and grocery price and fuel price inflation. And the reason for that is because what happens is inflation is very insidious. It begins where people think, well, the price of something's going to rise, so when I get paid, I want to go and spend my money and I want to buy that good. And then the effect is the price rises because you have more money. In the case of the government printing money and putting it out there in the system, you have more currency units chasing fewer goods. And so in the supply and demand metrics and functions of an economy, when you have more currency chasing fewer goods, the price has to rise in order to equalize that. So when people see prices rising, they panic or they start to panic and they say, well, I now need to go and buy that stuff before the prices rise again. And the classic example of this in the modern era is the inflation that occurred in Germany prior to World War II. They were printing money. So this is, the history lesson is after World War I, Germany lost. We all know that. And they had to pay, back then it was ridiculous sums of money. It was unpayable. It was hundreds of billions of dollars of reparations to the other powers. And of course, Germany had nothing to do that with because the whole place had been leveled due to the war. And so eventually what happened is they had to keep printing money or currency, and they had to keep reissuing currency because effectively that currency would go to zero. And there's some classic metrics and photos where people are actually taking currency that they'd just been paid in because all they could do back then was print it because we didn't have computers, and they were burning it to keep themselves warm. People were getting paid, and this happened in the UK as well. People were getting paid twice a day because the price of bread would rise. By the time they got paid in the afternoon, the price of bread had risen. By percent, I don't know. But the most the scariest thing about inflation is if you get into a hyperinflationary situation. This is exactly what happened in Germany, where the inflation rate went up to something like 100,000%. It might have even been more. And the metric that just pops out of my head is the fact that prior to the hyperinflation in Germany, an ounce of gold bought something like, was exchanged for something like 30 Deutschmarks or marks or Reichmarks, whatever the currency was prior to the hyperinflation. By the end of the hyperinflation, an ounce of gold cost something like 1.2 trillion Reichmarks or Deutschmarks or whatever they were at the time. It was horrendous. And a lot of people don't realize that we have had hyperinflationary situations in the modern era in the last 20, 25 years. Zimbabwe probably comes to mind. So I can't remember his name there, the dude in Zimbabwe that I don't know if he's still the leader. He might have died. His name will come to me in a second. But he just, as soon as he kicked out people and stole land from all the white farmers and so forth in there, and he started to wreck the country, he started printing currency with reckless abandon. And you can go down to any currency store now and buy like, $1 trillion Zimbabwean note. and say, hey, I'm a trillionaire, in Zimbabwe. But this is what happens when you print too much currency. So anyway, back to the velocity of money. So what happens is as money turns over and goes through the system quicker, that is actually what creates inflation. So there's a metric. If you want to watch this, for those of you at home following along and watching this, you can just look up what is the velocity of money or money velocity. And there is a metric. Now, I can't off the top of my head think of what a good metric is, but it's probably 1 to 2 times is, no inflation whatsoever. But once you get up into the velocity of money being 4, 5, 6, 7 times, it basically means that people are getting their currency and they're getting rid of it as quick as they can because they're worried about prices rising. And that is when you start to have, serious inflation and then potentially a hyperinflationary situation.
So that explains inflation, but why is inflation bad? Because I love the term that you used where you said currency units, because I think that's a really great way of looking at it, is that you need more units to purchase the same loaf of bread or can of Coke or whatever.
Yes.
Which then my head straight away says, well, hang on, then what I've got in my hand in terms of currency notes, I need more of them, therefore the ones I've got now are worth less, so it's actually devaluing. So inflation is devaluing what you have in your hand, right?
Oh, it absolutely is. And that is the mechanism. This is the insidious tax. You often hear about this. Well, you don't hear about it actually, but it is called the insidious tax because inflation, the reason it's bad, so that was your question, right? Why is inflation bad? Prices rising? Yeah. So the main reason is just what you've alluded to. It's because it erodes purchasing power. And a great example of this is to say, say in 1980, if you had a basket of shopping, how much would that cost? Now, let's say that basket of shopping back then cost you $10, which is probably, not too far from the truth. But nowadays, that same basket of shopping might cost you $100. And so we've had a huge increase or run in inflation. And in fact, the central bank has a metric. This is published. I mean, you can't even make this stuff up if you tried. They target 2 to 3% inflation every year. So effectively, they're trying to steal 2 to 3% of your wealth every year. Now, those of us who own hard assets, this is why people like property, but it's somewhat of an illusion in some respects. And I'll circle back around to, again, why inflation is bad. But those people who own physical assets like a property or gold or a classic car or something like that of value, they have an asset that will automatically adjust. So again, as more currency units are created, more people, they have to bid up the price of things. So that's why we've seen a monumental run, for example, in housing prices. All you would have to do is overlay a chart of housing prices in Australia against the growth of the money supply, and you'll go, well, that's interesting. There's a correlation there. More money gets printed, the higher asset prices go. But one of the issues, and we're now facing this, like right now we're facing this issue, which is your wages typically don't go up as fast as inflation. So if you think about, say, a 3-year period when we had some rip-roaring house price increases, some areas house prices went up 15, 20, 30% per annum. But your pay didn't go up 15% per annum. Rarely does it, right?
Yeah.
Usually your pay might go up, 1 to 3% because your employer has built into your contract that they'll give you a CPI increase. You get a 2% wage increase, but they're printing a ton of money, and we see house price inflation of 10%. Well, eventually we have a problem because there won't be enough people around making enough money to be able to afford that stuff. So that's a real serious issue, and that's how inflation ultimately affects everyone.
Mate, that's a really good point. Okay, so to recap from today, We got Lachlan calling past and saying g'day to my cowboy hat. The cowboy hat has been probably the biggest hit of the day by the looks of it, mate. Even better than your Federal Reserve
I know.
picnic.
I know. I got such a high demand that your customers, that your listeners have on, the imagery. I'm gonna have to come up
Mate,
with
it's going to
something
have to be. We'll have to do it every quarter. We'll have to have a cowboy session and say what's the latest in the cowboy financing. Michael wants to know if PJ, you can use your direct lines to the RBA and the Fed there, especially because
Yeah.
you're obviously on their doorstep, and just to let them know that a debt jubilee would be much appreciated. Thanks, Michael. I'm sure
Mate,
there'd be a lot of people.
I'll just
in fact,
walk in
most of the
after
world.
our interview and see if I can grab Jerome and have a quick chat and see what we can do about that.
Mate, I'm sure he's sure. Are you sure you're having dinner with him later? So let's go back on the recap because we are at the end of our show. Unfortunately, I know that our viewers and listeners are very sad on that because we could talk for a long time on this, but the problem is that we need to break it into bits because it's pretty deep, right? People are already getting their mind blown just listening to this episode.
Yeah.
Um,
It is very
So-
deep. It's a concept that that does, to get your head around it, you sort of have to, I guess, get rid of conventional thoughts around what money is and how it's created.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So we've touched on money creation. We know that the central banks and the intermediary banks do that, and it's all done via debt. So money is debt. In fact, there's a good doco online. If you haven't seen it, mate, I'm pretty sure you've seen everything. But for anyone playing at home, money as debt, or money is debt. Money as debt, I think it is a great doc on YouTube. It's worth a look. So that's how it's created, and then we go on to the devaluing of that money through inflation, right? So the more that they create, the actual less it's worth because it goes through the system, and inflation is actually money in the system, which the result is those prices in your shopping basket going up.
You got it. That's a pretty good recap.
All right. Well, that's good. And look, thanks for stopping by. We've got a couple of commenters and listeners there online today. Michael reckons if you can pass on that he'll send him a bottle of scotch if you can organise a debt jubilee. So
I'll work
good
on
stuff. If PJ's working on it, we'll consider it done. All right, PJ, thank you again. See you in a couple of weeks. And for those of you who are listening or watching, don't forget to drop in the comments any questions you have about this episode or ideas for others. We will be due for a mid-month market update, I think, next time that we hear from PJ. And we had some figures come out before we leave on that. If you got 30 seconds, mate. Figures that come out.
Yeah,
yesterday.
30 seconds. So figures that came out, I think this morning, our unemployment rate is horrendous. It's 7.1%. We've lost another 270 odd thousand jobs, I think, bringing the total to something like 800,000, a little over 800,000 people having lost their jobs. So we're not out of the economic woods yet. There's a long road to hoe to get us to the other side of this, and we're not done yet. So, yeah, not good for the average everyday Aussie out there.
No, and it makes a debt jubilee even more appealing. All right, thanks for your time again, PJ. Thanks for all our watchers and listeners online and for the comments. And this is Zenium Live. This is our fortnightly market update with PJ from Keystone Financial. And until next time, mate, you stay well and keep up with those cardigans. Mind you, I think my hat's probably the star of this show, right?
Awesome, mate. Thank you very much. See you next time.
Yep, see you guys. Bye-bye.